My name is Jan Schwarz. I'm a professor of strategic foresight and trend analysis at the Technical University of Ingolstadt. Still in my first 100 days in that position, teaching there in the new established Masters on Global Foresight and Technology Management, and building up a research institute on foresight. So a lot of foresight going on in the southern part of Germany currently. I think we're close to getting done. Well, what I will be doing in my presentation, it's less going to be around aspects of security of war, but it's more going to be on the, and I think that's what we kind of touched on in the last presentation, the one beforehand, how do you actually enable organizations to act on what the results of foresight studies or foresight activities are. So, and that's what I'm going to talk about in my presentation as soon as we have it on the screen. We're there? Close to. So we'll be around looking how do you combine working on the corporate culture of an organization or the culture of an organization while doing scenario work. The starting position really is here that scenario planning, as has been developed at Royal Dutch Shell, is very much around an approach that is aimed at providing alternative pictures of the future. I think that's what we also saw in the previous presentations. And it has been observed in many cases that scenarios that have been developed maybe elsewhere or elsewhere in the organization and then are presented to decision makers often do not lead to decision makers acting on them or making decisions based on them because they have a hard time connecting to them. Kees van der Heijden, whose seminal book on the art of strategic conversation just in a way turned 25 years old this year, has very much argued for scenario planning as being a mean of having strategic conversations within an organization. So what I would like to do is to look at scenario planning in the context of two other concepts. So first of all, of organizational culture, and then on the concept of open strategy, and explore how this fits together. And then by referring to a case study, try to highlight how this can be done and how the experiences that at least we made. Now, first of all, the field of open strategy, which probably emerged something like 10 years ago, very much argues that strategy nowadays should not be an exercise that is done by top consultants together with the top management of an organization, but should rather be participative in nature. And the key rationale for that is, of course, that it is a huge difference if I just present the organization with a PowerPoint deck and saying, okay, this is the new strategy, now please go ahead and implement it, in comparison to I've included as much people as possible in that process to have their engagement and have them already be part of the transformation or change process within an organization. And of course, what we see is that, for instance, with IT tools, we were able to do that a lot easier. For instance, having large brainstorming sessions about what are the key changes in the business environment one is currently seeing. So here the key argument really is that if we look at open strategy in forms of how large is the participation of people of the organization, how large might be the transparency also created within that process, one could very well argue that scenario planning is something as an approach that can function as a way to facilitate open strategy by including many people in that process. The other issue is, and this is around the culture of an organization, is as soon as I start talking about to include other people within a process, having a larger process, this means I need to consider what is actually the corporate culture of an organization. And the interesting thing is that if we look at the scenario planning literature, we see quite a bit about how scenario planning challenges the mental models of those being included. However, we do not see a lot of deliberate work really being done on the corporate culture and the relationship. So first of all, I think it is important to recognize that increasingly also coming out of the work of Kees van der Heijden, scenario planning is also more seen as an organizational intervention rather than something that produces a scenario report, which is then distributed. And what I would like to do now is also to, in a way, as a proxy to get your hands on what a corporate culture is, to introduce the ideas of looking at the values of an organization to understand what the corporate culture is. And as most of you know, if you try to show somebody the corporate culture of an organization, this is nothing that you have standing in front of the lobby, but where you will need to find a way to kind of assess it. What was influential for the project I'm going to show or introduce to you is this framework, what we call robust leadership. Arguing is that you want to, if leaders want to provide an organization with orientation, what they want to achieve in terms of what the long-term ambition, the vision is, at the same time they need to provide orientation in terms of how do we want to achieve that together. Because one would say in principle, confronted with the types of business environment we see currently, if I have a new strategy, if I want to implement anything around innovation, I will have to change the organization. So it's this twofold activity of arguing where do we want to go and how do we want to achieve that. And how this might work, I want to describe by referring to a case study where we did this. So we're talking here about a mid-sized regional bank in the northern part of Germany, 800 employees roughly. They came out of a merger a few years ago. They had a new CEO who came out of the organization, and two other board members were there for quite some time. The initial discussion when we engaged with their CEO was that they wanted to do scenarios on the future of banking to understand what they would need to do. So what is ahead of them, how would they need to adjust their business model. At the same time, they started talking about, well, how do we need to change our organizational culture? And of course, then we kind of started having the discussion, well, what actually is your organizational culture? They had not written it down. You might question how useful it is to write it down, but they had nothing like that. And the third thing was that they favored very much the idea of trying to include as much people as possible into that process. And that lent itself to an open strategy approach. So what we did is that and this looks probably less complex than it actually is, that we started working on scenarios and their values at the same time. And eventually then leading at the back part of that project to thinking about what are new business models. So how would they need to change? In terms of open strategy, there were two elements. So the upper one meant that the board decided that it's not going to be the 3 board members only, but also their direct reports, that were 12 people. And then selected further 10 employees out of the organization, cross-hierarchical, cross-functional, to join from the first day on the discussion around what kind of trends do they see in the business environment, what are our values, constructing the scenarios, and so forth. So it was a large group of people from all over the banks and all over the hierarchy joining here for this process. And then the second element of open strategy was the lower part, is that they conducted in between 2 workshop series. Each day, 20 employees they could assign to participate in the workshop to reflect on what are their views on what is changing in the banking industry, what the values of the organization is. So overall, through this process, there were 200 employees of the organization included. So a good chunk of actually the members of that organization. And I want to talk about 2, in a way, pivotal points we felt when we went through the process, and how these elements of working on the values of the organization and doing the scenario and the value work kind of combined each other. The first one is that when we went into the later part of the scenario planning process, trying to discuss around what could be the key drivers influencing the banking industry, we had at one moment that point where one of the participants said, and they were discussing quite a bit about blockchain, and said, well, you know what, actually, I don't really know what blockchain is. And then a lot of the other very senior people in the room admitted, it's the same thing with me. I kind of have a feeling that this is really relevant, but we don't really understand it. And it felt like that the discussion around how do we want to work together, openness, trust, transparency, actually helped them to have that type of an open conversation around we're lacking basic knowledge to actually make a decision on the long-term position of the bank. The second kind of crucial point was kind of that last workshop. When we started with the project, everybody was telling us, you can work as much as you will or you want on the culture of the organization. When it comes at the very end to allocating the resources to new projects, which means somebody will need to give away resources, that will be a huge fight that will be the same as in the past years. And the fascinating thing is that didn't happen at all. So it was a very constructive discussion at the end around coming to a conclusion, what do we need to do to be a successful bank also in the future? And it was felt in a way very easy to have that discussion. And the assessment was that through establishing a way of how the bank, the executives wanted to work together, having the open discussions around that, but also having a participative approach around what the challenges are in the banking industry in the future and what that would mean for the bank, actually enabled the organization at that last point really in the process to come to a conclusion that everybody felt was very beneficial for the bank. You are probably all aware of this quote from Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think it's probably fair to say that this is also the case for scenarios. So in concluding here, it felt like that, first of all, really understanding here scenarios as an organizational intervention to change an organization, using scenario planning to facilitate open strategy, to think about how can I include as much people as possible into the process was very helpful. And in a way, supporting working on scenarios by deliberately working on the organizational culture. Yes, I think those were the points I tried to make as quick as possible. Thank you.